Well, welcome everyone to this, the government track, where we're going to be talking about specifically public services and how we can make better public services with open source. Now, I'll start by going down the panel to actually get an introduction. I know we've just heard from Tony. So has everyone in the room heard Tony's presentation? Or is it, yes, we have a lot, not everyone. So I think, Tony, it is worthwhile just giving a very brief synopsis as well as we come past you. Don't assume everyone in the room heard your previous presentation. But we'll start with Martin, and then we'll come down this way to actually give the introductions.
Grand. So I'm Martin Woodward. I look after DevRel over at GitHub. And then previously to that, I had a real job rolling out sort of services and things across industry as a consultant, and my goal in life is to pay enough tax back to see what I got wasted when I worked in the private sector on government projects in the early 2000s. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. Thankfully, I live up north, so thankfully to our changing government, I should be achieving that goal quicker than I anticipated, but it's all good. So, and I'm going to talk a bit more about me in a bit. So, I'll hand to you, Tony, and you can do a quick one too.
Sure, yeah. Tony Shannon, I'm Head of Digital Services here in the Office of OGCIO, where we lead a team that are trying to help the better public services agenda here, try to tackle things like people's life events, we call them, with a set of open source, pretty much open source building blocks to actually underpin what we call a government as a platform based on an initiative that's come out of the UN called GovStack.
I'm Sachiko Muto. I'm the chair of an organization called OpenForum Europe, but I'm also a senior researcher at RISE, which stands for Research Institutes of Sweden. We're the state-owned research institute in Sweden, and I think I have done a couple of studies actually on sort of open source in the public sector. Also OSPOs in the public sector was involved in, so maybe that I will speak more as a researcher today. And thank you, Clare, for allowing people the opportunity to leave the room. And thank you all for staying as well. I mean, you were there last week in Brussels at our conference where my colleague came in. I was going to give the closing, and then my colleague said, and next we have, Sachiko closing, but they're going to close the cloakroom. So if you don't leave, if you have something that you want to still recover, go and get it now. So
But that is not the case here. So you never can calm down.
You can stay,
But if you've got something better to do.
Oh yeah, exactly. That too. So thank you. Thanks, Sachiko.
I'm Gar Mac Criosta. I work as a digital advisor in technology and transformation in the HSE. So for anybody not from Ireland, the HSE is the NHS in Ireland, which is probably the easiest. Everybody knows who the NHS is. I guess my role there, so we have a digital for care strategy, which is part of the digital decade in Europe, and it's really around digitalisation of healthcare services in Ireland and delivering those services to citizens, both here, but also it deals with how we're going to get you your data so that you can use it both here in Ireland for your care and looking after your health, but also internationally as well. So it brings in international standards, interoperability, and all that good stuff. I guess prior to that, and the reason I get dragged into this all the time is that COVID Tracker with the digital contact tracing solution in Ireland, there are people from Nearform in the room. They also, Nearform comes up all the time on this, helped build this. And so we, when we had built it, this was 2020. So we contributed to the Linux Foundation. It then turned into COVID Green, and it was used, I think Mary was talking about it this morning. So there was 11 different implementations in whole or in part across multiple jurisdictions and health regions across everywhere. So I kind of get called in, but it's basically, I feel like I'm living on something that it's like, that's so long ago. That my fondest moment was when we turned it off. It's the best thing. And then COVID is over, right? You don't know what it's like to live with something like this. It's like you keep it alive, and you don't want it to work. It's like, move on.
Well, I mean, that's certainly, I share the feeling. Let's hope that COVID is, well, it's not over, but let's hope that we no longer need the tracker app in the next little while. But let's talk about something that is a little bit more recent. So, I mean, so that was then. We heard earlier from Barry that the Irish government picks and chooses when it wants to use open source. So can you maybe comment from your perspective, the health service executive, if there is use of it today based on what was considered, I mean, well, first of all, retrospectively, looking back on the COVID app, would you say that was a success from an open source perspective, and why? And if so, when will it be, that pattern be, repeated?
So hopefully very soon. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I think from the point of view of, we kind of have to separate the world out, right? Because pretty much everybody in the room is using some flavor of Linux somewhere there. You're using some PostgreSQL, you're using something, right? So we're using all the components. We're building on top of Node, we're building on top of Kafka, we're building on top of all of these frameworks that are out there, right? And that's kind of a given. And I don't think anybody's going to argue for that. And going down the proprietary route and using specific things, I think we've all kind of got to the point where there's kind of a maturity that has grown, and it's kind of evolved, right? But the selection of those things kind of happens at a layer away from kind of government procurement, right? So it's not part of that stack. I think that's one of the bigger challenges. When we go to buy something, a system, right? Which is one of the fundamental problems in this whole thing, is we go to buy a system, as opposed to we're trying to deliver better healthcare services. Tony talked about this earlier, right? We're going to try and deliver better healthcare services. What does that look like? That's a service design problem. That's not a buy a system problem. But the procurement process involves me specifying, and I've been through this, right? And how many people have gone through a big government procurement? Right? How many have been on it for more than 2 years? Yeah, more than 4 years.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. Some of these things go on forever, right? And you gather, it starts out with a very clear idea and a clear vision, and then you start asking people, any stakeholders interested in this? Oh yeah, me. And then you end up with a skip load of stuff, right? And then you go to the market with an incoherent set of, and an understanding of it. And it prices, so it's like, there's a friend of mine, Roger, called it upsourcing, right? So you make it so big that only really big companies can bid on it, and then it ends up, you kind of enter into a different kind of ecosystem and you limit. So it's only truly that like big software companies can turn and go, yeah, we can solve that problem because we can solve every problem. You're into large system integrators, and there is a role for this, but we end up kind of creating this problem for ourselves by the way we think about the world, by the fact that we're thinking big, integrated, as opposed to modular. We're thinking in systems, not in services, and it kind of breaks at that level, right? And the procurement process itself, because it takes so long, if you're on something for 3 years, it's a lifetime. Sorry.
Okay,
No, I just wanted to show to Clare that I was interested in coming in on this, because I think, I don't want to take this too far away from what we're talking about today, but the procurement is very important, I think, beyond also just buying, government systems for, I think it's even a bigger issue, and I think there's been some recent interesting publications coming out of a professor from UCL, Matsukato, is really about sort of, to some extent we cannot, government cannot outsource everything what they're doing, because, society changes, and to be relevant to citizens and to kind of stay relevant, and you have to be part of somehow the change. And if you only, dipping into it periodically through, procurement processes like this, and you are not somehow co-creating the future, it kind of means that the public sector doesn't develop in time with the changing world. So she actually has a kind of a thesis around this, which I think is very interesting, and I think, as OpenForum Europe, we've been involved in trying to improve, we were tracking sort of, do they mention brand names and procurement, and we were just like looking at a specific problem, how many times are they looking for specific licenses and not just, trying to solve a solution, for procurement of IT systems. But I think it's even bigger than that. And there is now a revision of the procurement directive, which will take place within this current, the commission now. They are looking at revising the procurement directive. And there's going to be a challenge again, because this is not just relating to IT or digital systems. It's a fundamental piece of legislation that looks at the functioning of the internal market, right? So it's a very important fundamental piece of legislation for Europe, and it's also looking at why don't we buy this warship from only from the Irish companies, so they really, so it's we're going to have to get involved in this process, is what I'm trying to say. There's an opportunity now to get involved in the revision of the procurement directive, and as an organization, this is what we're looking at after the Cyber Resilience Act, and all that. We're looking at getting involved in this upcoming legislation. It's going to be very important.
And can I ask just a follow-up question on that specific area? So you mentioned that this is bigger than digital services. Is it directed towards public services, or is this broader? This is I mean,
Well, it's a public procurement
Okay.
directive, right? So it applies to the
Everything.
whole public sector, that for contracts over a certain amount, right? But that includes almost everything.
So we may come back to this because I know that part of the, I mean, I was at the event over in Brussels, the OpenForum Europe event over in Brussels, and there was a lot of discussion around, like, you know, Europe makes regulation, it makes policy, it does all this sort of thing, but it makes it very hard for the countries to actually then, like, take that up or implement it or whatever, and it's not, certainly not helping. And therefore it can overload, I mean, just having more regulations in this space doesn't necessarily help the ability to go modular and to actually move fast and all the rest of it. So maybe we'll come back to that, but I do want to actually, seeing that there's
Can I
energy.
close out just one
Yes,
point here?
come
Sorry,
on. No,
sorry.
come on, we'll come back to
So,
it.
because I didn't really answer the question.
Well, that's all right.
Just talked
That's all
about
right. I'm
it.
going with the energy of the room.
And then I remember what you asked me,
Okay.
right? But so there aren't. I mean, at the moment, there may be pieces of software that are operating under an open source license that satisfy or like will satisfy a problem that we're trying to solve.
Yes.
But there may not be an ecosystem there. Barry talked about it this morning,
Yes.
right? Were there enough Drupal people around to do the Drupal stuff that needs to happen? And if there aren't, then systemically, there's no ecosystem around to support it, so it doesn't work. I think the other side of it that goes unaddressed is, if I look at the amount, so I had the joy, so we had a massive cyber attack in 21, right? May 21. So we literally turned off every piece of technology in Ireland to do with healthcare. And then we turned it all back on again. And some of that stuff is old. And just to give you a sense of that, there are systems in Ireland where you can only buy discs on eBay because you can't get them. You're literally scavenging around to try and buy stuff, hardware, to stick into something and pray that it works, right? That's the truth of it. That there's really old stuff, dealing with legacy. So what we're talking about, it's all modern, it's all new, and it's all this. We have 50 years of health technology in Ireland, and that's across government as well. I would say you go into I think Louise done great. Louise is gone now, is she? Cleaning up Department of Agriculture, cleaning up revenues in good, like decent shape, welfare is in decent shape, but there's still lots of legacy technology out there, and it's an anchor to the past, and it doesn't mean that it's bad, it just means we have to factor that into our thinking as well, and it's not as easy as, oh, just do this new thing, right? I have to deal with the old stuff.
So no, thank you, and I like, I think it does. I suppose where I was leading as well with the question which I had asked earlier, and I'll comment now in a minute, but to ask the other folks to actually comment on this. But I suppose what really struck me again about Barry's talk today was about that they're looking for low risk, right? Like that the decision is coming around the risk levels, and I'm thinking there's an organisation, another community called Chaos, which is the Community Health Analytics open source software community. we have all the best acronyms, but anyway, Chaos.
And mascots, best acronyms, best mascots.
Best mascots, yeah, we need a mascot. Anyway, but the Chaos community, they do a lot about measuring the health of open source systems, and some of you may have actually heard Daniel Izquierdo's talk today. He's part of that community. But no one there is talking anything about risk. Like they talk about risk in the context of, you know, the bus factor. Is there only one maintainer? Are there security risks? But they don't talk about, is there an ecosystem around it? Like, if we choose to use this project in Ireland, will there, oh, there you are, Daniel. But if we choose to use this project in Ireland, will there be more than 5 people around to actually work on it? And that sort of level of risk assessment, I think, is something that perhaps is missing from the open source community. So I'll come now to you, Tony, because you were talking earlier about these building blocks you were building. So can you reflect, please, on this idea of the risk, where that leaves you in terms of risk, and then also basically maybe on that procurement issue, because that seems to be a juicy one.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you know, risk is definitely, you know, part of the culture of the civil service, you know. And there's a lot of talk about, I suppose, you know, risk in all areas, data governance risk, cyber risk, etc., etc. I think it reminds me of when I was in healthcare, the clinical safety, you know, was always, you need to be careful about doing anything in IT because of clinical safety. And I used to think, well, if we're going to talk about risk, let's talk about the risk in the current system. Let's think about how risky it is for a person to go into the emergency department in this city today where they don't have access to their records from the GP or from the hospital they were in last week. There's risk, you know. And in the same way across government, we've got silos of information, and we know that effectively impacts on people's lives. So there are risks in the current system. So that's the first thing I'd say. And then I think we need to talk about, you know, managing the risk. So, you know, understanding there's a baseline risk, then managing the risk. And I think, you know, the key to that is obviously to be open and honest and not try to pretend you're going to get the perfect system if you spend 2 years on a waterfall procurement, you know, and go out to the market, because you won't. But to do it in an agile, iterative way where you're prepared to fail fast in a controlled environment and learn from that. And if we're not able to have an open and honest conversation with the public about that, for instance around the digital wallet launch, you know, if we try to say that the wallet is going to be perfect on day one, we're going to fail. You know, we have to be prepared to be open. And when Gar's Health app they're about to release, as I understand it, Gar, is not fully featured. It's not got all the bells and whistles, but they're prepared
Don't
to
get too excited.
they're prepared to release early and release often, I hope. And by that you manage your risk. And
Can I just say the public spending code does not allow you to fail fast.
no, I mean, that's a leadership issue.
It's infrastructural, like it's part of the infrastructure and tapestry
It
of how we do
it
things.
is, but I think, I mean, I can see it now that, you know, this government, like every government, is kind of struggling to move into the digital age. I mean, you know, if you think about all the regulations that come down the track from Europe around the Interoperable Europe Act, the AI Act, the Digital Services Act, you know, the government is not structured to handle this avalanche and then you get into questions around regulation versus innovation at the European level. I think, you know, and then, you know, there's somebody asked me in the department recently to look at, you know, projecting 40 years into the future as to the impact of digital. And I said, hang on a second, you know, I think that's effectively a kind of a pointless exercise.
Yeah.
Let's think about how we can get into more agile policy making. And so the question then is, how do you get more agile government? Broadly, we're talking people, process and technology, getting the open source and agile mindset into people in terms of changing services. How do you make for more agile procurement? And for me, I think the exemplar for that we should see at a European level was led by the UK. If you had a look at government digital marketplace, I think it was excellent, because effectively you ended up having a reasonable bar of entry, as I understood it, to actually be able to say, I am going to, as a company, provide these kind of goods. And when I went to look for technical support for the whitetail component that we had here, I tried to look in Ireland, but there was no way to find that out. But you go to the Gov UK marketplace, and I was able to put in the building block that I needed, and I got 10 different companies that were pre-approved who had experience with working with that technology. So can you imagine a European ecosystem where the European Union has a marketplace of digital services where you as an SME can accredit to that to provide services with us to that building block technology? That's the way to do procurement in the digital age.
Yeah.
And we have to
You
try
need to
move
have
it.
choice. I mean,
Sure,
there is
sure,
a kind of, because talking about risk, any dependency is a risk, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's to a, you know, big proprietor like company, because of also changing geopolitical situation.
Sure,
This is now becoming a different issue. It's not just
Yeah.
about whether the company will be around, you know, but the terms to, you know, under which they will continue to supply service, for example. But also, sure, if, you know, you can also be locked into a small open source SME. This is also possible. Or there's only two. You know, you go back and forth between two local SMEs, and they're the ones who know your technology. So I think, you know, I feel that, you know, and I think, talking from the Swedish experience, I think we have gone too far towards outsourcing everything. Part of this change we're talking about, we have to build more. It's not about doing everything inside the government, but you have to at least be able to participate in agile processes as a kind of, and that requires more, I think, understanding and capability inside the government. Yeah, to at least be able to even participate in agile procurement or innovation procurement. You need to be able to lead that process and not just, you know, we talked before about buying off the shelf or whatever, but even, you know, if you're going to do that in a way that's you know, that's resilient or agile or sustainable, you need to have more in-house or in-government
build that competency
ability.
in-house.
Yeah, and sometimes be able to say, look, actually, this part we're going to do it ourselves
get it
or with
partner.
other, you know, governments, or, you know, because it's not just about doing it here.
Yes.
Other, you know,
And then
Irish agencies, or, you know, even like maybe European
And actually taking that, because we've been taking that from the European perspective in this respect. Now, Martin, I know you're sitting up north, but you actually have a global role. So I suppose it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective. GitHub obviously working with many global organizations. So hearing this discussion, you know, I can't imagine that there's any country where they say, oh, we got procurement like perfect, but you've obviously, GitHub has been working with like organizations around the world. So do you feel that this is a global problem? Let's check, not assume anything. And is there anyone who's trending towards a better way from a government perspective?
So nobody's got it solved everywhere is the problem. So different people have got little bits solved differently. So you mentioned India. One of the things that India are doing quite, done great is allowing innovation in that sector, but then also with their digital public goods, actually building things for a common good. But they're not, even though they're very, very nationalistic and have a nationalistic government right now, it's not being done in a nationalistic way. It's being done in a, well, everybody can know country, and you talk about the global south. They're part of that overall movement of, well, we're going to build it, but we're building it in a way where we understand this isn't a zero-sum game, that we win by everybody being able to collaborate and there being a free market of ideas kind of thing. And that's, we live as technologists. If you were to sort of plot out kind of the complexity of a system and then how well known the technology is, you get sort of a curve of how much it costs to build the system. And we live as technologists on the edge of chaos. If you've got a system and it's well-known requirements and the technology is well-known, like email or whatever, why are you going to build that? And why are you going to pay somebody to build it just because it's under a license that you religiously feel more entitled to? Why not have, it's a commodity now, go talk to 5 suppliers, make them beg for your business. But equally, if you're pushing the latest boundaries in technology, if you're trying to do digital wallet stuff, and you want to make sure it's interoperable with as many people as possible, then that makes sense to build on those things together. When it comes to procurement, it's everywhere has the same issues, and I think we've all done the same things. And at least in our economy, it's fairly there's a lack of corruption in the systems. And so while there's inefficiency and waste, it is a reasonably fair system. And it also encourages innovation and it encourages participation from people. So actually Ireland's doing pretty good when it comes to kind of innovation. It's below, Ireland's now found itself to be a rich country, and I don't think it's really realised that yet. But it's behind some of the some smaller countries, and we talk about this in my slide a minute around like Estonia and places like this. But it's doing reasonably well. But the thing that Ireland's got going for it is it's pragmatic, and it doesn't have 1,000 years of civil service like the UK has to bring along. It's got like 100 years of civil service. So there are areas where it's taking a very pragmatic approach. It's taking a very kind of realistic approach to what works. And most importantly, it's focused on the needs of the citizen, not on the needs of just building a stack for nationalistic interest. It's building a stack to serve the needs of the people in that country, which to me is ultimately the right approach.
And sometimes I feel that because Ireland is a smaller country within the EU, if the way it works here is the way it should work, because if it works here, it can scale up. But if you're building it for a large country that has decided to build its own stack because they can, then that doesn't scale down, right? That it's you can't bring that back to small.
And it would all be in French as well.
And then it would be all in French.
No.
French is really bad. No, we didn't. So we've gone to procurement here, and I think that's partially because when we think about public services, we need to be able to think about how we design and build them, and that is core to the system issues that I think we've often identified in this area. But I just want to kind of come back to that original theme around what does better citizen services, public services look like, right? So I think what we've been talking about here is our ability to be agile around building them, figure out getting closer to the customer, maybe dealing with legacy issues, all of these things that are there in the system today that we need to fix. But are there any other kind of attributes of good public services that align to open source? I'm just kind of curious, and it may be the wrong question, because as we've heard today, the fact that it's open source is probably, it's not that we're trying to justify that it's open source. However, I suppose in my mind, some of the principles that underpin the open source community and freedoms it provides means that it's better aligned to certain outcomes than others. And so I'm asking really from that perspective. Sorry.
Yeah, I think if we look at like previous administrations over in the States, what the Obama administration did really well was encouraging a sense of public service and public duty. And when you talk to civil servants in any country, then, well, the ones I get to talk to, because they're obviously super duper keen and you're like people who are here and interested and excited, they could get paid more money elsewhere, but they're doing it because there's a sense of public service. And I think if we can encourage that not only within the people working on those applications, but then the suppliers as well. Because when Nearform were being involved, it wasn't like, I remember talking to the team at the time, and it wasn't because, oh great, we've got a great government gig. It was, this needs to get done, we're going to get it shipped, and it's fostering that sense of public service in the private sector as well. I think that's a key thing that you can try and do.
Okay, I'll come back down again. Sachiko?
No, it's a pretty wide question.
Yes, it is.
And this is a personal opinion, but government services should be focused on the citizen. So it should be as close to the citizen as possible. And in Sweden we have a lot of local government. The local government is responsible for a lot of the services that are close for the citizen, like schools are a municipal business, for example. And I think, for me, when I talk about open source, it's not about cost saving, but it's about being able to access, the best technology. But it has some other things too, which allows for like customization and, maybe also directing funds towards this aspect. Instead of paying, a license for the basic technology, you can, use the technology and, potentially also kind of work with local SMEs to offer integration and to customize it to better suit local needs, for example. And so that is better public service, I think, which is something that is more closer to the citizen and to the local needs. So that's one thing. Maybe I can just say.
Gar, and then Tony.
So I think it's the wrong question.
Okay,
I agree with you, but I think
Change my
it's the wrong
question. Go on.
Because it is about better public services and it's
Okay.
irrelevant, right? So
Yeah.
the choice of whether it's like commercial off-the-shelf software, some software as a service bit or open source shouldn't matter, right? And part of it is it shouldn't. Like,
No, it shouldn't, but there are some elements.
There are elements,
Yeah.
but if you're conscious about what you're trying to do, and it's the conscious decision making to do it,
Yes.
and over a period of time, because what has happened, so if I look at the legacy and the history of how we ended up where we ended up, it's a bunch of people trying to make the right decision at a point in time and assuming that this stuff would disappear and change over time, and the rate of change and our ability to change. That has been a problem. I think if I look at the bits that we had to do, so we had a very small user research and user experience design team. I can't speak today for some reason, and we've had to scale that up because there are bits there, so forget the tech, right? It's that bit of understanding what it is, what problems we're trying to solve, right? What job to be done is there, and how are we going to do that? And then the stuff comes behind that. And in some cases, it'll make sense. In other cases, so we have, we've got HSE Live, which is like a call center and support service nationally, right? And that's running on Salesforce. We're not ripping that out, right? There's no reason to. It would cost us more to do it. Fine, right, move on. That becomes a constraint on the system.
Okay.
For things that we're doing, so say the wallet, like we went through, I mean, Tony, you remember this, like we went through 5 different wallet frameworks and it ended up here. It wasn't just, oh, we'll just use this one, because that's the wrong way to do it. So it was a conscious process of evaluation, trade-off analysis, looking at it and going, this works, and also looking at the ecosystem and support around it and go, actually, Open Wallet Foundation has some really interesting members, it looks like it's got scale and scope. We're going down a particular direction, so it fit, but it fit because it fit a need.
Okay.
Right.
But
Actually, I just want to, because we only have 1
Sorry.
minute left. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to come to Tony. Sorry, Sachiko. I'm going to come to Tony and just see if you have any final comments before we open it up to the floor, because I do want to get the panel.
Difficult to know what to add, but one thing does come to mind in terms of what the future might look like. In terms of the moment, we've got to talk about digital driving licenses and credentials of all sorts. If you look to Estonia, they effectively have a digital identity, where being a driver is just one attribute on your identity. Because at the moment there's a lot of friction in the system for people at different parts of their lives to be able to prove this, to prove that, to prove the other thing, to get into this, to get into that. The ideal, or in the future, I suppose we'll end up with people in control of their own identity as much as they want to. Concepts of data guardians for those who don't, but your data being safe and secure in a way that makes all of your interactions in your public and your private life much more seamless than they currently are. That probably going to happen.
Probably do have time for a very quick comment from Sachiko.
I just wanted to say about, like, I don't want to overemphasize the cost saving, but on the other hand, to build sort of and we've had a couple of scandals in Sweden where big cities go out and they procure like a school platform or something like that, and then Gothenburg will have one and Stockholm will have one, and and they're basically trying to fulfill the same thing that every other city is trying to do, and maybe they have done in other places too. And there, I think, is not a responsible use of resources to go out and procure, not to be able to use what's already, or even do it together with other municipalities and things like that, and to just like choose a license or a way to acquire that technology that allows you to share that and build it together with other public sector entities. I think it is a waste of resources to go out and procure that, on a kind of one,
yes,
over and over again.
Yeah.
And especially when the result in this case, in these cases were not very good.
Yeah.
So.
And I'd like to add in one more, if I may, just because, just from a personal experience, I don't know if anyone heard the example of Conscience, which is a non-profit. Saeed Chowdhury was sharing it, and it was they're a non-profit who are using AI to look into life-saving drugs that aren't profitable, and they're doing this in conjunction with the pharma industry, right? So, like the pharma industry are admitting that this is not top of their agenda because they're not the most profitable solutions, right? And there's loads of things in the world that are like that, even in the government case, right? There's loads of things that are not top of the agenda because they're not the most urgent things to be doing for public services. But there's always someone out there that needs that done. And I would add into all of this that one of the things that I find really great from an open source perspective is that gives the flexibility to individual citizens or groups to actually take whatever's there and do their thing, scratch their itch, and find the ways to make that happen. And I just suppose I want to add that into I think that agility you're talking about in terms of the public service doing it, or even procuring it with a third-party organisation, that always assumes that the priority is there in government, but there'll always be things that citizens may want to do that are not necessarily the priority of government, and giving that flexibility is sometimes a good thing. But anyway, sorry, that's a little aside, and we have a question ready to code.
This is a question for Tony Shannon. My name is Philip Chalman. I'm currently studying free open source software. With regard to public faith in services that are provided, it's very good to talk and implement some processes, but if in the end those processes get completely ignored and trashed, that's not going to lead to faith amongst the public in the processes of government. And so I was actually quite shocked to hear that you decided or felt the UK services provision was the gold standard, given the scandal we had over PPE contracts and VIP lanes that absolutely tied up civil service in contracts for mates, basically, that didn't actually produce any benefit to the public.
Sure. Well, I lived in the UK for 17 years, and I was there during the National Programme for IT, which was a £6 billion disaster.
I was in that too. That's what I'm trying to pay the tax back for.
So I'm aware of the failings of the UK government, but I wouldn't be critical of them entirely, because if you look at the GDS standard, which was effectively about putting the user first, agile development and open source, they have led the world in that thinking at a government level. And it is to that I give credit. And I think their work on the government digital marketplace, again from my own experience of it, and I was working with UK-based SMEs at the time, I think it has done some good things. I mean, the Fujitsu post office story in England is a disastrous story. But what does that tell you? It tells you about you need to be careful about giving contracts to big companies where there's a proprietary lock on the code, does it not? That's my understanding of that story. So I think, on balance, I think the UK government to its credit, has some good stuff to teach us. Not all on its own, but it's not all bad either.
Sorry.
And just because we do want to make sure that we have more questions.
Paul Murphy, founder of Vitalism Civic Innovation. I wanted to go back to the introduction this morning where we saw a direct correlation between the level of digital transformation in government services and the percentage of GDP of the technology sector within those countries. You brought up Mariana, who wrote the Big Con, which talks about the capture of the consulting industry of government transformation. It's a shame that we don't have the academic stream, in this room as well, because I think that we underestimate the desire of citizens, particularly young people who are technology conscious, to, and I think we need to say it, hack the government. They're not happy with democracy, the way that the government is serving their public. And what did you guys, see this as a problem? Like, shouldn't citizens be interested in breaking the system, using their skills, building companies out of it? Are there examples you can give?
I can just say, Omar is here. Maybe you heard him from this morning. We organized this conference. I helped organize this conference in the UN, and UNICEF was there, and they really had this message about the future. And we cannot build a future for younger generations if they are not part of building that. It needs to be accepted by them. And I think right now I'm in last week I was in Brussels, and there's a European project now for bringing public awareness to open source, and we handed out an open source award, and there we also talked about this need to kind of make sure that even within open source, which at some point was seen as a very disruptive technology, there is this graying of open source, and to some extent all the people that were in the room celebrating how open source had grown up, they were all part of the establishment within open source, and we have to be, I think, open to these disruptive elements, and not just and to recognize that at some point we are all we all become part of the establishment, even if we're open source. This was maybe not really a question, but I think that it's something that is very difficult to be open to. It's very difficult to be open to new things.
It is.
It's a really interesting question. Yeah. And it's one we grappled with. So the Digital for Care strategy in Ireland has a whole piece on digital health literacy, right? And that's at multiple different levels. So one of the programs, so in schools in Ireland in fourth year, it's a TY year, and it's a transition year. So it's less structured, it's more work placement. So there's 33,000 kids do it every year. Captive workforce with 33,000 people, right? But it's, how can we leverage something systematic like that? So my kids, I've had 2 kids go through it, and it needs structure. So we've got some interesting things that it could do. We went big on STEM a couple of years ago. We're going to run these programs. So if you take the HSE app, right, and I cannot guarantee at this point that we will open source it. I desperately want to, right? And then I want to be able to run things like this for programs, like STEM type programs for kids in there and for kids who are in university, and to be able to actually go through that process and open it up and see. I think the other one, which it's probably the untapped potential. So we've talked about the wallet, but the idea of giving a verifiable credential out to a citizen in a wallet opens up putting in, and we had a thing, we ran an event last year, and it was like the citizen as a service integrator. One of the biggest problems in government is integrating 2 government departments together. There's massive walls between the 2 of them. We've spent hundreds, if not billions, trying to connect up things. If you, all of a sudden, I'm putting something in your hand that you can present to somebody else that's independently verifiable, it means that these 2 agencies don't need to care. I just need to be able to verify, trust you as an issuer and verify. And that requires a trust framework, which is the thing that sits on top of all of this. If the trust framework is in place and the governance is around it, then think about the power of the citizen as the service integrator in terms of disrupting how we deliver services in Ireland.
But right? The trust has to come first. I was at the Open Digital Wallet, Open Wallet Foundation launch in Davos a couple of weeks ago, and you could see the interest from some governments in digital identity, and at the same time that is not acceptable by all citizens. It was actually hosted by the Swiss government. And the Swiss, they tried to implement a Swiss law on digital identity, and it failed the first time because indeed there wasn't the trust that what are you going to do, you know, if it's the central, you know, we have this digital identity. And there are also the refugee, you know, like the refugee council, or forget the organization, but you know, like not everybody sees that it's going to be in their interest. You know, it can be very
Can I just say
useful,
that, like, so
but it can also be used for control, not just for you know, self.
but the
Final
decentralized.
comment, Gar.
Well,
Final
no,
comment.
no,
Yes,
it's on the,
yeah.
so the HSE app started life as part of the Ukrainian response and trying to figure out how do we deliver health services to people who'd landed from Ukraine as a result of the war. And that's where the idea, but the idea of decentralized identity, where it's in your hands, and then all of a sudden, so it's different. But there is a relationship and there is a trust piece there, 100%. But we can't solve it. Like, we're quite a high trust society, right? So we can get away with it, whereas in other countries, and it's a variability across Europe, and let's say you go to the Netherlands, trust relationship there with government, it varies. You go to the Nordics, like Sweden,
Yeah,
it's
we trust our government.
I know,
Implicitly.
yeah, implicitly. And so we're somewhere in between. We kind of trust it. It's like, yeah.
So I'm going to have to call time
Sorry.
because we have promised to give people the freedom to go and walk with their two legs wherever they want to go to. But what I will say is thank you so much to this panel. I really want to say thank you, Martin, thank you, Tony, thank you, Sachiko, thank you, Gar. For me, I think there was a lot of themes here that just scratched the surface, and I think that we have many longer conversations to have in the future. But thank you all very much, and thank you all for your participation as well.
Thank you.